Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Premier. We recently learned that the Liberal government has confirmation that Grassy Narrows First Nation is still being exposed to mercury poisoning through the contamination of the Wabigoon River. But the Premier says that the report that confirms this, delivered to the government in September of 2016, never made it to her desk. The Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation says it wasn't a communication breakdown, and that the ministries don't, and I quote, keep the Premier of the day in the dark. But if the Premier is to be believed, that is exactly what happened. This is a glaring mistake that shines light on incompetence in the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation and this Liberal government in general. Why didn't the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation tell the Premier that he has confirmation of a systematic poisoning of an entire Indigenous community?
Be seated, please. Be seated, please. Thank you. Premier.
Speaker, this is an extremely important issue. What happened at Grassy Narrows decades ago, Mr. Speaker, has to be rectified. And when I was Minister of then Aboriginal Affairs, Mr. Speaker, I travelled to Grassy Narrows. I met with the community. I met with the chief, Mr. Speaker. I came back to the ministry, and we worked to determine, Mr. Speaker, if there was science available that it would allow us to move. One of the things that we were concerned about, Mr. Speaker, was that the disturbing of mercury in the water system would actually make the situation worse. As soon, Mr. Speaker, as I learned through meeting with David Suzuki and Dr. John Rudd, Mr. Speaker, we learned that there was new science, that there was the ability to clean up the system. That's why there's $85 million, Mr. Speaker, that is set aside, that is at work. The scientists are there, Mr. Speaker. That cleanup is beginning. This has to be rectified, Mr. Speaker, and we are the government that has acted on that.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Again, to the Premier is just one person. She has an entire team of staff, cabinet ministers working for her. It's hard to believe that no one in the Liberal government thought that this information was important or that it would save Indigenous lives. This report should have raised alarm bells and throughout this entire Liberal government. What disciplinary action is the Premier planning for her Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation for this potentially life-threatening oversight?
Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, there should have been alarm bells in the 1970s, there should have been alarm bells in the 1980s, there should have been alarm bells in the 1990s, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact is, it has taken until now for this government to act, because previous governments did not take action, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? The reality is that it was not clear exactly what the science was, exactly what action should be taken. But we have now taken action. This was a poisoning of a water system, Mr. Speaker, that should not have happened. And what it does, Mr. Speaker, is it raises huge cautionary notes in terms of how we go forward, how we continue to work with our Indigenous peoples, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that such a thing never happens again. And that is why the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation spends so much of his time working with communities, working with chiefs. We're going to be meeting with the chiefs of Ontario today, Mr. Speaker, because we know that those relationships have to change, and so that something like this never happens again.